The relocation of Japanese Americans into internment camps during World War II was one of the greatest violations of civil liberties in American history. According to the census of 1940, 127,000 citizens of Japanese descent lived in the United States, the majority on the West Coast. One-third had been born in Japan and therefore could not own land, become a citizen, or vote in some states. Anti-Japanese paranoia increased because of a large Japanese presence on the West Coast. Japanese Americans were suspected of remaining loyal to their homeland, despite the lack of any concrete evidence. After the Japanese bombing of Pearl Harbor on the 7th of December 1941, rumors spread, fueled by race prejudice, of a plot among Japanese Americans to sabotage the war effort. Popular opinion and advice given to Roosevelt led the president to sign Executive Order 9066 on the 19th of February 1942, 2 months after the attack on Pearl Harbor, that ordered the relocation of all Americans of Japanese descent to concentration camps on the West Coast. President Roosevelt was pressured by farmers who were trying to eliminate Japanese competition, a public fearing sabotage, politicians hoping to gain by standing against an unpopular group, and military authorities. Fred Korematsu was one of the few that opposed the order. He challenged the legality of Executive Order 9066, but he achieved nothing. The Supreme Court justified the executive order as a wartime necessity. Others that opposed the internment include J. Edgar Hoover, who believed internment was unconstitutional and that all spies had been caught shortly after Pearl Harbor, and Eleanor Roosevelt, who tried to convince her husband that Japanese internment was inhumane.
As Japan rose to the world stage, many nations began to recognize its power. Britain signed the Treaty of Navigation and Commerce with Japan in 1894, which allowed Japanese people to enter and reside in any of Britain's colonies or former colonies. From 1897 to 1901, 15,280 Japanese people immigrated to Canada, all entering British Columbia. Almost all of the immigrants were single men who found work as either fishermen or worked in fish processing plants. Nearly all of the Japanese people who immigrated to Canada came from Wakayama, Shiga, Hiroshima, or Kagoshima. In Canada, anti-Asian sentiment was already established even 70 years before World War II. There was a number of policies aimed at regulating the social and economic activity of the Japanese in Canada, and these argued that Asians were paid lower wages and worked longer hours, which resulted in fewer jobs and a lower standard of living for whites. It was commonly held belief that Japanese work ethic might overthrow the province. As a result, this group was denied the franchise until 1949, and most mainstream professions were entirely closed to them. On December 18, 1941, Japanese attacked Hong Kong, killing 2,000 Canadian soldiers. In response, the federal government required Japanese aliens to register with the RCMP, also considered necessary to prevent sabotage on the Pacific coast. The Canadian government ordered that 1,200 fishing vessels owned by Japanese Canadians be brought to the nearest port, where they were impounded indefinitely. Japanese language schools were also shut down. The Canadian Pacific Railway even discharged Japanese Canadian employees, which led to dismissals in most of other major industries. Due to arson and vandalism aimed at Japanese Canadian businesses, it became increasingly difficult for them to buy insurance and operate business.
Around 127,000 United States citizens were imprisoned during World War II for simply being Japanese. Almost two-thirds of the interns were Nisei, or Japanese Americans, born in the United States. Some had never been to Japan, and some were even Japanese American veterans of World War I, but that made no difference. Evacuation orders were posted in Japanese American communities, giving instructions on how to comply with the executive order. Many families sold their homes and their stores. Properties and inventories were often sold at a fraction of their true value, due to the mad rush to sell. Before the concentration camps were completed, many of the evacuees were held in temporary centers, such as stables at local racetracks. 10 camps were finally completed in remote areas of 7 western states. As you can see, most of the 10 relocation camps were built in arid and semi-arid areas where life would have been harsh even under ideal conditions. Sites included Tule Lake in California, Minidoka in Idaho, Manzanar in California, Topaz in Utah, Jerome in Arkansas, Heart Mountain in Wyoming, Poston in Arizona, Granada in Colorado, and Rover in Arkansas.
In Canada, over a 9-month period, 22,000 people were taken from their homes and scattered throughout British Columbia, and by October 1942, the Canadian government had set up 8 internment camps in interior British Columbia. They were in Coslow, New Denver, Tashme, Rosebery, Slocan City, Lemon Creek, Sandon, and Greenwood. Since the war caused a large shortage of farmers, especially sugar beet farmers, the Security Commission Council organized sugar beet projects to combat the labor shortage. They gave Japanese males the choice of whether they could work in road camps as slaves or go to the beet camps and be with their families. Working in the beet camps was the choice taken by the majority of Japanese married men. Furthermore, on January 19, 1943, an order in council liquidated all the Japanese property that had been under protective custody by the government.
Housing in the camps was rustic, consisting mainly of tar paper barracks. Families dined together at common mess halls, and children were expected to attend school. Adults had the option of working for a salary of $5 per day. The U.S. government hoped that the interns could make the camps self-sufficient by farming to produce food. But the soil was arid and cultivation was quite a challenge. Evacuees had the opportunity to elect representatives to meet with the government officials to complain about their conditions, but all was in vain. Recreational activities were organized to pass the time. As you can imagine, life in the so-called relocation centers or concentration camps was not easy. The camps were often too cold in the winter and too hot in the summer, and the food was mass-produced. The interns knew that if they tried to flee, armed soldiers who stood watch would shoot them. Some economists have pointed out that the Japanese not only lost their property, but also lost economic opportunities in a time when most Americans were enjoying wartime prosperity and the tremendous increase in land values on the Pacific coast.
In the camps, many families were forced to live in cramped quarters, with 10 other families sharing one stove. Some camps, such as Slocan City, didn't have the resources necessary to house the huge amounts of people coming into the camps. Many Japanese were placed in tents until there were houses available. Most houses consisted of panel board with no insulation, thin walls, and maybe a stove. During the harsh, cold winters, many Japanese put lanterns under their bed to try to keep warm. They were not surrounded with barbed wire, as were the camps in the U.S., but conditions were rustic and crowded at first, with no electricity or running water.
When the order was repealed in December 1944, many found they could not return to their hometowns. Hostility against Japanese Americans remained high across the West Coast, even during the post-war years. As a result, the interns scattered across the country. The last camp closed in March 1946. In 1948, President Truman encouraged Congress to pass what became the Japanese American Claims Act. The Claims Act was only important symbolically because it was inadequate as a financial settlement for losses of real property. In 1952, the McCarran-Walter Act passed over Harry Truman's veto and erased the final ethnic and racial bars to immigration and naturalization, so that Asians, including Japanese, could become naturalized citizens. In 1976, on the 34th anniversary of FDR's Executive Order 9066, President Ford proclaimed, "We all know now what we should have known then. Not only was that evacuation wrong, but Japanese Americans were and are loyal Americans. On the battlefield and at home, Japanese Americans have been and continue to be written into our history for the sacrifices and contributions they have made to the well-being and security of this, our common nation." In late 1980, Congress and President Jimmy Carter created the Commission on Wartime Relocation and Internment of Civilians, the CWRIC. The Relocation Commission's aim was to determine whether any wrong had been done to Japanese Americans during World War II, and if so, to recommend appropriate remedial action to the Congress. In June 1983, the Redress Commission made 5 recommendations to Congress on what kind of action should be taken. They called for 1. A formal apology by Congress, 2. The remission of penalties for people who had gone against the law while resisting the wartime restraints placed upon Japanese Americans, 3. Congressional recommendations to government agencies to restore status and entitlements lost because of wartime injustices, 4. Congress to establish and fund a special foundation to, quote, sponsor research and public educational activities, and 5. A payment of $20,000 to each Japanese American survivor who had been incarcerated because of ethnicity during World War II. In 1988, Congress acted upon all these recommendations when it passed the Japanese American Redress Bill, called the Civil Rights Bill of 1988. Each survivor received a formal apology and a $20,000 reparations check from the government. American concentration camps never reached the levels of Nazi death, but they remain a dark mark on the nation's record of respecting civil liberties and cultural differences.
As World War II came to an end, King allowed the Japanese the choice to be deported back to a war-stricken Japan in an act that he believed to be merciful. Their other choice was to reestablish themselves at the ends of the Rockies. On May 2, 1947, the SS Marine Angel left Vancouver carrying 3,964 internees to a war-devastated Japan. Those who remained in Canada were forced to reestablish themselves in central and eastern parts of Canada. It was not until 1949 that the last of the wartime restrictions were removed and Japanese Canadians were allowed to return to the West Coast. In 1949, Japanese Canadians were granted the right to vote in British Columbia after gaining the federal right to vote in 1948. In 1988, 46 years after the first Japanese internment camps, Canadian Japanese were compensated for all that they had endured during the war. Prime Minister Brian Mulroney signed a compensation package giving $21,000 for each internee survivor. In total, $12 million were paid out.